2001, Steven Greer broke our minds with his hypersonic missile of a book titled Disclosure. The term disclosure in this context refers to UFO disclosure, unraveling the UFO cover-up and the implication of the technology underpinning UFOs for humanity. Greer was an ER physician, and he characterized himself as a simple country doctor and family man. The fact that Greer has a medical license, and especially that he treated patients in an emergency room of all places, immediately conferred on Greer a baseline level of credibility. The book fosters the impression of an ordinary man who's discovered profound, life-changing information and wants to communicate that information to the world for the benefit of human progress. Greer repeatedly depicts himself as having sacrificed a comfortable life for this greater calling of being a messenger for disclosure. The book is about forbidden knowledge and a hidden reality we all live in. Greer is a controversial figure in the UFO realm. I'm not going to dive into the controversy surrounding Greer. Disclosure is an evidence-based book, and it changed my life. It showed me that the world is more magical and fascinating, but also horrible than I ever thought could be the case. This is the story of Steven Greer's 2001 book, Disclosure. I'm Tim Stone. I'm a lawyer in New York. I began my career as a prosecutor, and I'm also an author. I investigate and I write about the unexplained and the mysterious. A quick request: if you enjoy this video and you want to see more, please do hit subscribe and hit like. The YouTube economy runs on people pressing those two buttons. It's totally free, it takes fewer than 3 seconds, and it's incredibly helpful for content creators. I'd appreciate it if you consider pressing those buttons. The main points of the book can be broken up as follows. First, that we're being visited by advanced ET civilizations, as Greer describes it. Advanced non-human craft have been downed, retrieved, and studied by the United States and by other countries since as early as the 1930s. This area of study and the resulting scientific knowledge, and probably spiritual knowledge, are tucked away in the most highly compartmentalized black program in the history of the United States government. This program, or programs, have long escaped legitimate public oversight. This corpus of knowledge has led to breakthroughs in our understanding of physics. Elements within society have developed forms of energy generation and propulsion. In other words, anti-gravity propulsion devices, which don't require burning fossil fuels, nuclear energy, or any other traditional form of energy as we understand it today. These systems draw power from zero-point energy. When I read Greer's book back in the early 2000s, this was the first time I'd encountered that term. It means energy in the quantum vacuum all around us. Greer describes this as, in essence, unlimited free energy. In the book, Greer goes on at length into the implications of this kind of free energy for human society. He describes site-specific energy systems that will eliminate air and water pollution, power recycling, power desalination in agriculture, turn the deserts green, he writes at one point, replace all forms of travel with silent above-surface movement that eliminates all forms of pollution, including noise pollution. I've lived in New York City for quite a while, and the idea of eliminating noise pollution seems pretty attractive to me. These energy systems would obviate the need for public utilities, or at least for energy utilities. Each home, office, or factory could have a self-contained energy generation device, eliminating the need for transmission lines and pipelines. The bottom line, and a pillar of this book, is that free energy exists and that it's being withheld from humanity. The UFO cover-up began in black special access programs within the federal government. Programs within programs within programs. Think of those Russian nesting dolls. Greer refers to them as unacknowledged special access projects, or USAPs, an acronym he uses throughout the book. Certainly by the Eisenhower administration, the reality of the UFO phenomenon and the technology underpinning the propulsion of the non-human crafts had been outsourced, at least in material part, to the defense industrial base in the United States. Hence, Eisenhower's farewell address, in which he warned about the risks of the rising power of the military-industrial complex.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
It's important to note that defense contractors are not subject to public transparency laws, and they can keep secrets, proprietary secrets, in perpetuity. Richard Dolan, a historian and ufologist, describes the powers that keep this technology hidden as a breakaway civilization. This is a power center that operates separate from and parallel to our commonly understood civilization in terms of things like scientific progress. This covert breakaway civilization is able to send people across our solar system, maybe even across the universe, using next generation anti-gravity propulsion and perhaps even more exotic forms of technology. Meanwhile, the regular civilization we all know is still aiming to send astronauts to the moon using archaic chemical propulsion. How is the secrecy maintained? Despite hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions or even tens of millions of people having seen non-human craft traversing our skies, bodies of water, those in power insist that, or until very recently, have insisted that UFOs do not exist. Sightings and experiences are met with official denial from authority centers. We're social creatures. People will do anything to avoid embarrassment and humiliation. I and many others can attest to the fear of public speaking. People will risk death to avoid speaking in public or being embarrassed, being ridiculed. We're afraid of being judged, being looked at by those around us as stupid, as inarticulate, as ignorant. What can only be described as a strategy to deny the existence of UFOs and ridicule them. This strategy hijacks this element of human psychology. Greer quotes a retired military official who does a really good job summing it up. And I quote, "And we are conditioned by our own paradigms not to accept the possibility or probability of a highly advanced intelligent civilization coming here to visit us. You have evidence in the form of highly credible reports of objects being seen, of the entities inside these objects being seen. Yet, we look for a prosaic explanation, and we throw out the bits and pieces of the evidence that don't fit our paradigm. So it is a self-keeping secret." Greer urges that authorities use what he calls ET false flags to further muddy the waters. In this bucket, he puts abductions, animal mutilations, and other aspects of the UFO phenomenon that are viewed as dark and sinister. Greer argues that these are simulated, these are man-made, and they're done to muddy the waters, to gin up collective hatred and fear of aliens or non-human intelligences, to create a dialectic of an us versus the aliens world. I disagree with this part of Greer's thesis, and I'll revisit this later. When all else fails, wet works. Wet works is the term that's been bandied about in popular culture recently. It supposedly refers to a term used within government or government-adjacent spaces to describe targeted assassinations against citizenry. Greer presents evidence that, indeed, physical threats, physical harm, and assassinations have been effectuated against citizens in order to keep this secret in place for decades now. I found other aspects of the book particularly thoughtful and effective in the way they supported Greer's case. One was how he focuses upfront, really before he dives too deeply into other topics, on how this massive secrecy was and is maintained. He begins with pages of quotes from generally people he'd interviewed in the book about this secrecy infrastructure. This is really an effective approach, in my opinion. Anyone reading this book, especially when it was first published, anyone without any background in the UFO phenomenon that maybe has a superficial familiarity with the phenomenon from popular culture, but hasn't actually read or analyzed evidence about the phenomenon, the associated cover-up, naturally will be extremely incredulous that this could have been going on for so long and that the public wouldn't be aware of this, that a secret of this magnitude, this grave, could be kept for decades upon decades. This, after all, challenges our worldview. It creates cognitive dissonance, as I described in the last episode, between how the world actually operates and our understanding of the world. It creates a chasm between those two abstractions. And that dissonance is uncomfortable. No one wants to be told that your beliefs are false, or you are duped, or the things on which you've based your life, your convictions, are in fact partially or wholly false. It's like pulling the rug from out under you. It's especially true for older people. You don't want to be told everything you believed in was a carefully curated lie or misrepresentation of some deeper, more powerful reality. So Greer wisely, in my opinion, up front includes these quotes, these passages from these witnesses about how this cabal came into being and how it maintains secrecy for decades now. Greer is preemptively countering that natural thought process that we have when we read something that shocks our mind, which is, this can't be true. I would have known about this if this was true. Structurally, the book then covers evidence categorized by the source. So in the first section, for example, accounts and documentary evidence involving pilots and radar. The radar evidence is powerful because it corroborates human observation. So Greer here is preempting another reflexive criticism that people have, that human perception and memory are flawed, untrustworthy. Next, Greer goes into accounts and documentary evidence involving nuclear power. UFOs are often witnessed in connection with nuclear power, whether it's the testing of thermonuclear weapons in the 1950s, when we were blowing up bombs over the Pacific or in the Southwest United States. It's incredible that we were doing that back then. Whether it's nuclear-powered weapons being stored in missile silos throughout the world, whether it's nuclear-powered combat systems like aircraft carriers and submarines, or whether it's nuclear power plants. One of the most robust sections consists of accounts and evidence from government insiders, of those involved in events where objects of extraterrestrial origin have landed or have crashed or been forced down and which have been retrieved. Greer goes for the numbers in the government insider section. He marshals evidence from over 36 insiders, people who, during their careers, generally intelligence officers, soldiers, astronauts, bumped up against the UFO phenomenon. It's one thing if one person says something. For example, if this was a book about one person's claims. It's another if you have more than 36 people who give their names, their identities, their credentials, and are all attesting to the existence of a similar phenomenon and a similar cover-up. Now I'm going to review what I found to be compelling pieces of evidence that Greer presents. I'm focusing on 3 so-called government insiders who bumped up against the UFO phenomenon and the associated cover-up at some point during their careers. Keep in mind, this is just a sampling of the evidence. There is a tremendous amount of evidence in this book. It's quite a long book. The text is small. Gordon Cooper was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. At the time this book was published, this was 2001, Cooper was the last American to fly into space alone. The vignettes involving Gordon Cooper are interesting because he's a high-profile figure. As is the case with many astronauts, at least historically, there's a universal level of trust for astronauts. Based on the video of the interview that underpins this account in Greer's disclosure book, it's not hard to find Gordon Cooper credible witness. He's this older American, no nonsense, to the point. Just strikes me as a forthright witness of things he didn't understand and wanted to understand, but to which he was denied access. Cooper had 2 compelling direct experiences with UFOs in his life, and he also talks about accounts of some of his close friends. First, while piloting planes in Germany in 1951, Cooper encountered what we know as today as Foo Fighters. And I quote, "These objects, these UFOs, kept coming over, flying in the same kind of formation that we fly in our fighters while we were flying in Germany. We were flying F-86s. They would come over and do the same maneuvers that we made, except every once in a while, one of them would go zip and make a maneuver that you can't do in a conventional fighter. They were definitely in formation. They were flying fighter formations very definitely under control. These are Foo Fighters." Cooper's second experience with UFOs involved a fascinating incident at Edwards Air Force Base. This occurred after his 1951 experience with Foo Fighters.
The cameraman filmed the installation of a precision landing facility we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And the saucer flew right over him and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. I had a chance to hold it up to the window and look at it. It was certainly good found. I think they're for real. I think eventually we'll find out that there's regular travel here on this Earth from other planets.
An interesting postscript about Cooper's experience on Edwards Air Force Base is his palpable frustration when he's asked about whether he was able to follow up on the video that he and his colleagues made and what exactly they witnessed that day. Cooper says, "How would I keep in touch with anybody? There is no way in the military or within government of keeping track of something that is classified unless you are directly involved in it, and I was not. I had no way of knowing what happened." Cooper also conveyed the account of a close friend who was a pilot of a major airline. And I quote, "I have a good friend who is a commercial airline pilot, and he has had about 3 different occasions where a UFO has pulled up right alongside his wing and stayed in formation with him. He is in a major airline. The airline has a policy that their crews aren't allowed to talk about UFOs." What's fascinating to me about Gordon Cooper's account, and it's true of many of the accounts in this book, and I'm sure many anecdotes people hear from their family and friends and acquaintances, it's how profound these experiences are when you think of them in the grand scheme of things. By itself, for example, the Edwards Air Force Base incident or the Foo Fighters trailing him, that's evidence that we're not alone on this planet or in this universe or in this dimension that we're in. It's as if they're lost to history, and all you have is this, frankly, frustrated old man, this old ex-military man and astronaut Gordon Cooper, near the end of his life, who's recounting these remarkable experiences. In the lake bed instance, Cooper's turned over footage to nameless and faceless officials. And just like that, physical evidence substantiating humanity's contact with another advanced life form is flushed away. It vanishes into a memory hole. In other parts of life, major human events are studied, pondered, debated. They live on through human thought, memories, analysis, curiosity. But UFO events and other paranormal and esoteric occurrences, they're reflexively rejected by Western society. Even when there's physical evidence, such as the video at Edwards Air Force Base, it disappears into a bureaucratic black hole. Where is all this evidence, this physical evidence that's been collected? Steven Spielberg in Raiders of the Lost Ark has that gigantic government warehouse where all the evidence about the secrets of the universe are stored away, hidden from public scrutiny. For me, at least, it creates this hollow and sickly feeling, trying to destroy evidence that doesn't fit the paradigm we live in, whether it's political, economic, cultural.
Stephen Lovekin was a military cryptographer and later became an attorney.
His experiences occurred in the 1940s and 50s. Lovekin was taught about the UFO topic as part of his education into code breaking and cryptography in the bowels of the Pentagon. Lovekin was in the White House Army Signaling Agency under both Presidents Eisenhower and JFK. Lovekin also had a relationship, or at least an association, with President Eisenhower, and he gleaned insights about the UFO phenomenon from his relationship with that historic figure. Lovekin is different than Gordon Cooper in the sense that Lovekin didn't just incidentally encounter the UFO phenomenon. He was also brought into the fold of the cover-up to a limited degree. In 1959, he recounted how he was being taught about cryptography. Specifically, he was in the radio frequency engineering offices in the bowels of the Pentagon. It was there that a colonel brought out a piece of metallic debris with inscriptions on it. The colonel explained that the debris was from a crash of an ET vehicle in New Mexico in 1947. The colonel then discussed with what was effectively a class that incident at length. This included the fact that there were ET bodies and that one was partially alive at the time of the discovery of the crash. And I quote Lovekin's account, "And when he told us what it was, that piece of debris, it was eerie. You could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. The inscriptions looked like hieroglyphics. The writing was very expressive. The colonel had a stainless steel box and a lock on it, almost like a carpenter's box, but maybe bigger. He told us that there were other sites with crashes of ET craft in addition to the New Mexico site. The details here are extremely fascinating, and they point to the veracity of the account." Lovekin had the opportunity to engage with President Eisenhower when Lovekin was in his role in the Army White House Signaling Corps. Lovekin described how the president, and this is interesting, used to doodle UFOs, or he would draw UFOs. He would do that in all kinds of meetings. Lovekin described how Eisenhower was just a kid, like he was almost childlike in his fascination with UFOs, and he was so excited about the topic. He described him, and I quote, as very, very interested in the UFO topic, and in particular in the shapes and sizes of the UFOs, what we describe today as the morphology of the UFOs. Lovekin recounted how Eisenhower got sold out in terms of the UFO topic, how corporations in the private sector, the military-industrial complex, took control of likely the physical evidence, the technology, the secrecy surrounding the topic.
But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. Without him knowing it, he lost control of what was going on with the entire UFO situation.
Lovekin told Greer, and I quote, how it had been discussed with me on numerous occasions what could happen to me if he talked about UFOs improperly. In other words, if he divulged UFO information to those not in the know who shouldn't know. At one point, an older officer was talking about being erased, and Lovekin said, "Man, what do you mean erased?" And that older officer said, "Yes, you will be erased. Disappear." That older officer said that those kind of threats had been made and carried out starting back in 1947. That older officer warned Lovekin that the Army Air Force, the Air Force was a division of the Army at that point in time in American history, was given absolute control over how to handle this, the UFO topic. This being the biggest security situation that the United States has ever dealt with, and that there have indeed been some erasures. That older officer also told Lovekin that, quote unquote, they go after not only you, they will go after your family. The government will, quote unquote, make examples of people.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. I said, how do you know all this? Or something to that effect. And he said, I know. He said, those threats have been made and carried out. He said, those threats started way back in 1947. The Army was given, or the Air Force, was given the absolute control over how to handle this. This being the biggest security situation that this country has ever dealt with. And there have been some erasures. He was very convincing, and when he said this, and he was in a position to know. He was much older than I, and he had been involved with the CIA, and so he knew what he was talking about. I mean, he wasn't just kidding. So I guess fear has done it. He said they'll go after not only you. He said they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words. And so I can only say that the reason they've been managed to keep it under wraps for so long is through fear.
The idea of erasing people is particularly interesting in light of recent news of several deaths and disappearances in the scientific world. As reported by numerous media outlets, in the recent past, almost a dozen individuals linked to UFOs or UFO-adjacent scientific fields have died, in some cases purportedly by suicide. In other cases, they've simply gone missing.
That there's no evidence the general was suicidal. We have to ask now the possibility of foul play. Is there somebody who has interceded to take the general out of the picture? He was a man with some of the most sensitive US military intelligence secrets in his head. There was a discussion underway in which General McCaslin was involved. It's a matter of public record now that his emails were part of emails being circulated where it was being discussed that Hillary Clinton, as president, would be making a disclosure about UAPs.
The mystery deepens, and a story News Nation has been out in front of since the beginning. Nearly a dozen scientists and government officials, take a look, have disappeared or died under strange circumstances, all within the last 4 years. Many reportedly held high-level security clearances and had access to sensitive information.
I hope it's random, but we're going to know in the next week and a half. I just left the meeting on that subject, so yeah, pretty serious stuff, but we're going to be now. Hopefully, I don't know, coincidence, if you want it, whatever you want to call it, but some of them were very important people, and we're going to look at it over the next day.
Sounds crazy, but between Garcia and General McCaslin, I have to wonder, and again, I know this sounds crazy, but it could be an option here. I mean, is the government doing this? Are they taking out their own people?
On that note, I'm focusing on two additional witnesses whom Greer interviewed. and whom he talked to about the secrecy, the threats, and the violence surrounding the cover-up. The first is Lance Corporal Jonathan Weygandt. In late March or early April 1997, which at the time was only 4 years before disclosure was published, Weygandt was in the Marines and training to be an air defense gunner on a surface-to-air missile system. Weygandt traveled to Peru to provide security to a radar installation, ostensibly meant to track drug aircraft going in and out of Peruvian and Bolivian airspace. One day, he was ordered, just following orders, to a location to secure a crash site. Weygandt and his fellow soldiers came upon a 200-foot ridge and found a huge gash in the land and, amazingly, a mysterious object buried in the side of the cliff. Weygandt said, and when I first saw it, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. It was really confusing. The craft was about 30 feet in width and about 60 feet in length. He described it as shaped like something between a teardrop and an egg. It was, quote unquote, really organic. It looked, quote unquote, almost like art. Interestingly, the craft was leaking a syrup-like liquid that was greenish purple. It was as if the liquid was alive. And every time you looked at it, it was a different shade of greenish purple. The gooey liquid got into his camouflage clothing and ate through it like it was acid, like it was the blood of a xenomorph. The machine had a hum like a bass from an amp when they arrived, and it cut out shortly thereafter. It had vents sort of like fish gills. The surface of this craft did not reflect anything. And, amazingly, there were evidently creatures inside. They appeared to have been communicating telepathically with Weygandt. They were calling for him to help them and conveying that, quote unquote, everything was going to be all right. That brings to mind several recent UFO whistleblower accounts, including that of Jake Barber. Barber was part of a quasi-military special operation force that was tasked with recovering UFOs that had been downed or discovered. Barber piloted a helicopter to retrieve and transport an egg-shaped UFO. While he was carrying that UFO in a sling under the helicopter, he had a life-changing telepathic interaction with an entity or entities that were in that egg hanging beneath his helicopter.
Oh, I felt like something connected with me. I felt like something had tuned in to me and my soul and was providing me some sense of guidance. Once it was just me and that object in between the pick and the drop site, there's about 20 miles in between, I felt like something was inside of me. I felt like I was possessed by the most beautiful spirit I'd ever been possessed by. And
Was it loving?
it was loving. But there was a sense of sadness at the same time.
The situation for Jonathan Weygandt then took a traumatizing turn. Weygandt described how the Department of Energy, a bunch of officials from the Department of Energy, showed up in Peru. Weygandt was arrested. He was cuffed with both hands down, and his legs were tied with plastic fasteners. The men cursed at Weygandt and suggested they were going to kill him. They then detained him for 2 days. An Air Force lieutenant colonel at one point told him, and I quote, "If we just took you out in the jungle, they would never find you out there." They made him sign paperwork and claim this situation, quote unquote, never happened. And if you tell anyone, you will, quote unquote, just come up missing. He spent 15 hours at one point in an interrogation room, handcuffed to a chair, a light shining in his face, being yelled at, no food, no water. It's like something out of a movie. They told him, "We are our own program." This is the Air Force lieutenant colonel telling him this. "We don't obey. We just do what we want. We are going to take you off in a helicopter and we are going to kick your ass out in the jungle and we are going to end you. You didn't see anything. We will do you and your whole goddamn family."
No, they said that, you know, that I was, they were cussing at me, saying that I was a dumb with that. Why don't you people ever, you know, pay attention to orders, and you weren't supposed to be there, and you're not supposed to see this, and you know, you're going to be dangerous if we let you go, and all this stuff. And, you know, I mean, I thought they were going to kill me for about 2 days, I think. And they had a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, and he told me, you know, if we just took you out in the jungle, you know, they'd never find you out there. Like, you got to sign these papers, and you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened. And if you tell anybody, you know, you'll just come up missing. And he was a real abrasive, just a cynical, I guess is the best way to put it. It was more like an interrogation room, and I sat in there for, I don't know, 15 hours those guys with a light. I mean, they put this light in my face and they were yelling at me. What'd you see? And he's like, yeah. He's like growling. You know, he goes, are you a patriot? You like the Constitution? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, we don't, we do what, you know, we're on our own program. You know, we don't obey. We just do what we want. And he's like, yeah. And they're like, and they're growling and they're relishing, you know, and they're yelling at me and they're hollering and cursing. You didn't see anything, you know, and we'll do you and your whole goddamn family. And they're, you know, it was basically that for about 8 or 9 hours. I mean, they took breaks. They were like, look, man, we're gonna take you off in a helicopter and just kick your ass out in the jungle, and we're gonna edge you and all this. And
this calls to mind accounts of recent whistleblowers. This includes another Marine, Michael Herrera, who described discovering a 300-foot unidentified craft in the jungle of Indonesia back in 2009, along with his platoon. The UFO in that 2009 case, however, appeared to have been piloted by special ops types with American accents. Men in black camouflage swarmed Herrera and his fellow soldiers, detained them, and threatened their lives. Back to Weygandt. Reflecting on that episode, Weygandt noted that the craft they discovered, that teardrop egg-shaped craft, had gashes in the side and looked like it had potentially been hit by a surface-to-air missile. There were at least 30 men, these Department of Energy personnel, with hazmat suits or hazard suits on, who marched past him as he was being taken away. And Weygandt describes their behavior as almost routine, like they'd done this in the past and they were just doing it again, just doing their job. The implication, explicit by Weygandt in his interview with Steven Greer, is that the U.S. shot down this UFO and that this was a common occurrence. Greer also interviewed at least one insider who was part of this disinformation campaign and who attested to the reality of government or quasi-government sponsored assassinations. This was Master Sergeant Dan Morris, a retired Air Force officer who described himself as a National Reconnaissance Office operative. Morris was active on the scene, in the UFO sphere at least, from 1947, the year of the Roswell crash, to 1968. Morris claimed he held a top secret, what he called cosmic clearance, that dealt with access to UFO information. Morris also claimed he'd been a member of teams that, to use the term euphemistically, influenced public opinion on the UFO subject. And I'm quoting Morris now. I would go interview people who claimed that they had seen something and try to convince them that they hadn't seen that or that they were hallucinating. Well, if that didn't work, another team would come in and give all the threats and threaten them and their family and so on and so forth. And they would be in charge of discrediting them, making them look foolish. Now, if that didn't work, then there was another team that put an end to the problem, one way or another. As I've said, as a book, Disclosure is unorthodox. It's unusual in the way it's structured, the way it's presented, and it was the first time in my life I'd read any book like that. But that's part of what makes it really compelling. The cover of the book in particular is really well conceived. It's made to resemble a secret briefing document almost, that was pulled together and contains secret or classified intelligence. If you're a bibliophile, don't expect good spelling. Greer and his team effectively acknowledge as much. They stamp on the cover, it says pre-publication rush edition, which is a recognition that the book itself, from a writing perspective, is kind of a hot mess. And there are caveats from Greer in the book itself where he talks about there being grammatical mistakes and typos throughout. It was rushed to press, the idea goes, to get something ASAP to as wide an audience as possible. Spelling be damned. The book is jammed full of astonishing evidence, whether quotes from prominent figures like astronauts, raw transcripts of interviews with government insiders, or grainy photocopies of declassified public records. The book includes Greer's intro, his big picture assessment of the topic, its implications for mankind, and his views on how and why this was kept secret. This book accomplished its goal. Greer turned me into a convert on the UFO topic and sent me down a path of lifelong curiosity and investigation. My most significant criticism of the book is the shade that Greer throws at phenomena associated with UFOs that have negative connotations, even insidious connotations, like human abductions, like animal mutilations. Greer claims that these are, as I described, ET false flags. I challenge that assertion by Greer. Are people being brainwashed into seeing human beings floated out through windows of apartment buildings in New York City into flying saucers hovering over the East River. There were witnesses down below on the highway passing the building. There was the person being abducted, being floated out the window. There were witnesses on a nearby bridge, people driving over the bridge thinking they were seeing a movie being filmed outside the window of an apartment building along the East River. I don't think that's a simulation or a trick. I think that was an event witnessed by multiple people. Once there's mainstream acceptance of the reality of the UFO phenomenon, the next logical question will go to the abduction phenomenon. People who for decades have been claiming that they have been physically experimented upon and interacting with these non-human intelligences. The implication is that non-human entities can essentially blink into existence and take us out of our beds at night, float us into ships, and experiment upon us like we're some lower life form. We don't think of ourselves as a lower life form, but we are, relative to this technologically and likely spiritually advanced life form, or life forms. We're not safe in our homes, in our bedrooms. Private property doesn't matter. Security doesn't matter. It's just the way it is. Perhaps Greer, when coming forward with this information, recognized that this is not a palatable part of the phenomenon, that things like abductions and mutilations would scare away the public. Thanks for joining me on this episode. I hope you come back for episode 3, where I'll be covering the Hudson Valley UFO sightings from the early 1980s. That was a wave of sightings in and around New York where thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people observed amazing aircraft during many evenings. The book will be Night Siege, co-authored by J. Allen Hynek, the famed astronomer from Northwestern University who was the scientific consultant on the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was the public-facing arm of the Air Force's study of the UFO phenomenon for quite some time. Night Siege predates disclosure by more than a decade, and it's a more traditional but equally fascinating compilation of evidence from investigative reporting on those waves of sightings. There's some very strange features about those sightings, and they're really hardly ever discussed. So it's going to be interesting diving back into those. Until then, see you next time on Catskill Liminal Walk.